first piece of survivor-led research I came across when I first went back to college after having been having had a breakdown in the 70s, finally sort of in the mid-80s, I'd had ECT and everything, and I was still trying to come to terms with ECT and what effect it had on me, and I felt that I was starting from scratch all over again. Hadn't done a degree. I felt like I thought everybody, well, not everybody but me. I thought that people who got degrees were somehow above me, and I'd never attained that wonderful status. I'd missed out and all this. I'm very sorry for myself. I was seeing a therapist in my mid-30s, and she encouraged me to go back to college, and I was like, oh, how can I go back to college? I'm a working class mum with 2 kids, just starting school. I'm not going to get a grant, yada yada yada. So, and she said, well, give it a try. So I gave it a try, and like 4 years later, I had a degree. So it was only because I was trying to prove to her that I couldn't do it, and that the whole society was against me. There you are. But I found luckily I was very lucky that I did a degree that I was able to actually look at the impact of shock treatment as one of the things that I studied, because it was a degree in science, technology and society. And I dropped into this little left-wing bookshop, which we don't have anymore in London because we don't have any more left-wing, but I found this book, the history of ECT by Leonard Roy Frank, and he gathered together everything he could find on shock treatment, right back to the use of electric eels by the ancient Greeks and things like that. It's an amazing book, and basically, and he researched this because he was given Blitz ECT in the early 70s. His family decided that he didn't fit in, and they got him ECT'd, and it was the time when they used to give this Blitz ECT and just try to sort of get everything out of a person's head that was didn't fit into society. And he said it was like they cut a swathe right through his memory, and he'd lost loads. He didn't even remember who the president was or anything. And he was very angry about it, and still is angry about it. So one of his ways of making sense of his life was to start compiling his history of shock treatment. I found this, it was amazing for me to find this book. It was really helpful and gave me quite an overview. He doesn't just put in the anti-ECT, he puts in everything, but he's clearly very, very anti-ECT. At one point in the early history of ECT, he recounts, somebody wrote a paper listing 52 different medical theories about how ECT worked. Including ones about it destroys your memory. They were quite, people were a bit more open-minded about saying what ECT did in those days, or it just makes people feel that having proper treatment. Anyway, there were 52 theories, so that just showed, I think the patient's perspective came into those theories, but it just shows that psychiatrists don't really know what they're doing and why they're doing it. They're kind of casting around. I don't think they even bother with theory anymore, they just do it. But yes, it's quite a checkered history, and it was amazing to have the opportunity to really study ECT and find out quite how non-evidence-based it really is. Because the patient's perspective has been automatically discounted, since people have pointed out, we're not regarded as reasoning human beings, or in history we haven't been. I think only by coming together as large groups and networks can we begin to reclaim that status as reasoning human beings, which we are. More recently, I only got this book about last week in New York. Linda Andre, who's been an activist in ECT, anti-ECT, for as long as I have or more, she's now come up with an amazing book on ECT. Which is very, very well researched and very thorough, and it's a perfect example of kind of socio-technical study, which is what I'm interested in, where you look at the social impact of the technology, look at it from a social perspective as well as a scientific perspective, and sort of show how inadequate the research is or how biased the research is. And she's done a brilliant job there. So it's well worth getting hold of if you can. Another piece of research, very influential influential survivor-led research was the Wellbeing Project. It ran from 1986 to '89. Jean Campbell, service user researcher in the United States. It was similar to the Strategies for Living research, before Strategies for Living, looking at what helps and what hinders people's well-being. All the interviewers were service users, and they carried out 500 face-to-face interviews and produced a report, video documentary, statistics, history, art and writing. So multi-method, multi sort of output, multimedia output, and looking at things that were of concern to service users, not just the usual clinical trial type information. This was the first piece of user-led research I did for a government-funded disability project, looking at the views of Black and Asian service users in a particular area of London. That was quite an experience. And this one, that's Strategies for Living research, which I was a lead researcher on, that Alison just talked about. And this was also part of the Strategies for Living work, Healing Minds. In this one, I brought together all the evidence I could find on complementary and alternative therapies in mental health, including acupuncture, homeopathy, nutrition, aromatherapy, massage, spiritual healing, etc. And I found evidence that there's clear evidence that service users and survivors want alternative therapies. If that was a criteria for us getting treatment, and the evidence is there, we do want them. The evidence is also there that when we get them, we value them and we feel that they're helpful. Particularly what people valued were lack of side effects, improved feeling of relaxation, feeling of optimism and well-being, and being treated as a whole person. I think those are really good outcomes. I mean, they're not what figures in randomised controlled trials, but why not? If you're feeling better, isn't that a good treatment for depression or anxiety or anything? Got to be. And some research shows that complementary therapies can reduce the need for psychiatric drugs. But there's very little investment in researching these because they don't fit very well with the standard methodologies. Randomised controlled trials aren't set up to demonstrate the particular aspects of complementary therapies that I've mentioned, particularly the aspects of empowerment, choice, respect, individual treatment, healing partnership between the professional and the client, the holistic model. It's very individualised, so it's very hard to standardise that in the terms that randomised controlled trials want. So because of the dominance of biomedical model in research, we don't get any evidence, so these therapies continue not to be used. A more recent piece of user-led research was Jim Reed's work on coping with coming off psychiatric drugs. This again was voluntary sector sponsored, that was Mind. And similar to Strategies for Living in that the work was done by service user survivor researchers who carried out telephone interviews and in-depth interviews about people's experience with trying to come off psychiatric drugs. They found a lot of things that kind of differ from what the standard knowledge about drugs. They found that SSRIs are actually quite difficult to come off when they're not supposed to be. Generally, the longer a person is on any kind of drug, the harder it was to come off. They found that 2/3 of the people who came off neuroleptics and mood stabilisers did that without the doctor's advice, and so most of them were able to come off successfully. And they were at least as successful as people who came off with the doctor's agreement. Very controversial even to do this kind of research. Where they got the most help from was counsellors, support groups, complementary therapists, peer support, information from the internet and from books. They got the least helpful group were doctors who didn't in most cases wouldn't help people come off if they wanted to. Would advise them to stay on the drugs. Mind are one of our national mental health charities in England. they've always given standardised advice to people that if they want to reduce their medication or come off, they've got to get a doctor's advice. But following this research, they've changed that advice and just said that you need to seek information and help from a wide variety of sources. So that's one way in which research has influenced Mind's advice to people. They don't say go and ask your doctor now, they say seek why, because they've understood that doctors don't advise people to come on and aren't particularly helpful at predicting who can come off and helping them to do it. So, I mean, that's not necessarily about coming off, it's also about actually reducing drugs and making your own choices about them. So I don't think Mind was saying everyone should drop their drugs, but like, it's about patient choice really, and getting the information you need to manage your own medication and treatment. Jim's now brought out this book, Psychiatric Drugs, which is based on that research, but also he's put a lot more in it about aspects of psychiatric drugs. The service users have written